네,
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed your meals. I enjoyed mine. We will now begin session 1 of the Hankyoreh-Busan International Symposium under the title of New Cold War Between US and China and Asia's Diplomacy and Security Tasks. We will now begin session 1. This session will be moderated by Honorary Professor Soo-gwon Kim of the National Diplomatic Academy of Korea. He has served as Korea's ambassador to Finland and Laos, and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he has been dealing with North Korean nuclear issue and the Iraq-US alliance. We have also invited as speakers Sung-bae Kim, Chief Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy, and Professor Chang-hoon of Pusan National University. We would like to invite the moderator and the two speakers to the stage. Please welcome them with a round of applause. I would like to also introduce our foreign participants from the United States, contributing writer to Washington Post, John Pomfret, and from China, Professor Su Yinhong of Renmin University. They will be linked with us online. Because we have invited Korea, US, and China online, there may be some disconnections. Please, I seek your understanding on this matter. I would like to invite the moderator to the stage.
사회자님, 감사합니다.
Thank you to the MC for introducing the panel. And also, I'd like to extend my welcome to Mr. John Pomfret from Washington Post for joining us online. And also from Renmin University, we have Professor Shi Yinhong. Welcome to you too. Thank you very much for joining us. And as for Dr. Kim Sung-bae and Dr. Chang-hoon, they've been introduced quite well by the MC, so I will not be introducing them again. Since we have two scholars who will be joining us online, we will take some time to listen to their speeches or presentations for about 10 minutes each. And then we'll proceed to a general discussion or free discussion. May I speak in Korean?
I'm sorry, I communicated with you in email, but I didn't have time to say hello to you personally. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
그리고 Professor Shi, we communicated
Yeah.
by email likewise, so nice to meet you.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Nice to meet
Yeah.
you. Nice to meet you all.
네, 기대가 큽니다. 그러면 without further
All pretty excited. We will go in the alphabetical order, starting with Mr. John Pomfret, and then Professor Shi In-hong, then Mr. Kim Sung-bae, and then Professor Cha Chang-hoon.
말씀하시죠.
So, should I begin?
Yes, 그러시고요.
Yes, please begin. And like I told you through email, I would like to ask you to speak about the next U.S. administration's Asia policy and China policy. Because we're talking about the U.S.-China New Cold War and Asia's tasks, please speak in that context. And I would also appreciate it if you could also talk about, share your insights with the Korean audience. And if you could also talk about the U.S. election and how that will impact the US-China relations and the kind of impact it will have on the Korean Peninsula and also on Korea-China relations. Thank you very much.
Please.
Great, thank you. Should I be speaking and waiting for a translator, or should I just go through the speech straight on?
We will have 우리 동시 통역할 예정.
We are providing simultaneous interpretation, so you do not have to pause.
Wow, okay, that's great. So it is great pleasure here for me to join you at the 16th Hankyoreh-Busan International Symposium. I want to personally thank Director Yinhong and also Ambassador Kim. It's a great pleasure here to be here with old colleagues such as my old friend Yinhong, along with Professors Kim and Professor Cha. I think we can assume that we're going to have a new American president, that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States, inaugurated on January 20th, 2021. Clearly, President Trump is intent on wreaking as much havoc as possible. We can only hope that he doesn't take us all down with him, but he's going to give it a college try. But let's just assume that it's going to be a Biden administration. So during his years as vice president, Joe Biden liked to boast that he'd spent more time with the leader of China's Communist Party, Xi Jinping, than any other world leader had. Together, the pair had logged 24 hours of private meals. They'd even slurped noodles together in Beijing. They'd logged 24,000 miles of travel together. And that familiarity meant that Biden had, to steal a line from President George W. Bush, the opportunity to look into Xi Jinping's soul, if you will. But interestingly, as a candidate for president, Joe Biden pivoted and he called Xi Jinping a thug. And he claimed that Xi Jinping did not have what he called one democratic bone in his body. And I think that how the United States fashions its relationship, it's really its most consequential foreign relationship, will depend on a lot on which view of Xi Jinping the president-elect embraces. Now, to be sure, American presidential candidates are prone to make nasty comments about Chinese communists during elections, right? That's just kind of par for the course. Bill Clinton accused his predecessor of coddling tyrants from Baghdad to Beijing. George W. Bush on the campaign trail named China a strategic competitor. But both of those presidents actually ended up with policies such as ushering China into the World Trade Organization that added a dose of rocket fuel accelerant to China's rise. President Trump, on his part, careened from cultivating a bromance with Xi Jinping to blaming China for all the COVID-related problems faced by the United States. Still, Biden's harsh rhetoric, his accusations that Xi Jinping is a thug, I think reflect a fundamental shift in America's view of China, and one that has been propelled by Trump, but also one that will survive the president and will remain a fixture of US attitudes on China for this foreseeable future. In late 2017, the Trump administration signaled that it would take a tougher approach when it described China as a revisionist power in its first national security review. In America writ large, the latest Pew Research poll from July found that 73% of American respondents had negative views of China. It's 73%, the highest percentage since Pew began collecting such data in 2005. Then only 35% reported negative attitudes towards China. It's similar in a way to South Korea's polling on China as well. Now for Biden, the challenges will be to balance these instincts that he's honed as a lifelong deal maker, which could lead him to soft pedal criticism of China in exchange for cooperation on, say, climate change, and the blunt reality that the ruling Chinese Communist Party is not turning China in a more liberal direction, as generations of Americans believed it would. Now, some of Biden's advisors, such as, some of Biden's advisors, such as Susan Rice, have advocated a softer approach towards China. As national security advisor during the Obama administration, Rice opted to avoid provoking China in some matters, such as China's militarization of the South China Sea, its human rights record, and predatory trade practices in order to get deals in other areas like cyber espionage, only to be very embarrassed when China broke the cyber espionage deal as well. Other advisors have taken a more critical view of China and have generally backed the analysis of the Trump administration that China is intent on replacing the United States as the preeminent power in Asia. An example of this would be Kurt Campbell, who served as the top Asia official in the Obama State Department. Campbell believes that there is a broad recognition in the Democratic Party that Trump was largely accurate in diagnosing China's predatory practices. But how broad that recognition actually is among Biden's inner circles remains an open question. And Campbell, who is its most high-powered advocate, might not even have a role in the Biden administration, right? His wife, Lael Brainerd, is on the short list to be the Treasury Secretary, and it'd be tough on their family to have two of them in high-powered, very important government jobs. Now, very early into his administration, Biden will confront a raft of China-related questions. Will he continue tariffs on Chinese goods? Will he continue to sanction China Telecom's giant Huawei and try to block its plans to roll out 5G in nations around the world? Will he continue sanctions on Chinese officials for their crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong or maintaining camps in Xinjiang? Will the Biden Justice Department continue its prosecution of Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, who is fighting extradition to the United States in a Canadian court? And what if China offers assistance on climate change, which Biden has termed an existential threat, or commits to help America fight COVID, which Biden yesterday labeled as his administration's first priority? But what if China's price involves a rollback of all of the steps the Trump administration has taken to constrain Beijing? Once again, Biden will be faced with the kinds of deals that the Obama administration often accepted, a promise for better behavior in the future in exchange for a win for China today. Now, Biden has signaled that he wants to embed his China policy in America's alliances, especially those in Asia. Biden has noted that America makes up only 25% of the world's economy and has accused the Trump administration of poking its finger in the eyes of all of America's allies, South Korea included. Biden has said that the way to deal with China will be to get the rest of the world behind the United States and then confront Beijing. But approaching China with a broad front, while attractive in principle, will also demand hard choices in practice. One example would be the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't think there's any chance of the United States rejoining that trade compact anytime soon. In addition, America's allies all want different things from China. Japan, for example, is a strong supporter of any move to counter China's militarization of all the surrounding seas in Asia. However, it is less supportive of steps to limit Chinese campaigns to influence domestic politics, which has become a big issue, for example, in Australia. South Korea, another key American ally, is increasingly fearful of almost anything China does, following a damaging economic embargo that Beijing imposed on your country after the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile system. From what I understand, Seoul would be hard-pressed to agree to a tougher policy against Beijing. I can imagine that early into the Biden administration, Beijing will be tempted to test it, and it could very well do so via a proxy. In this case, let's say North Korea. Yes, I'm aware that Beijing is not in the complete puppet master in Pyongyang, but it has significant influence there. And if Kim Jong-un is interested in conducting another nuclear test, Beijing will be interested to see how Joe Biden reacts. China, of course, does not like the presence of a nuclear armed power, even an ally on its doorstep, but it far prefers that to the prospect of a united Korea. And I think it's important for all of us to understand this clearly. China's priority on the peninsula is to keep the Koreas divided. Denuclearization is not even a secondary goal. Probably the best advice for Biden is to wait. The Chinese Communist Party views the United States as a nation in decline, and given our woeful response to COVID and our fractious political situation today, you can understand why. So only when Biden can reunite America's allies and right the American ship of state will engaging with China yield any positive results. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to an interesting dialogue.
네, 감사합니다. 이제
If President-elect Biden takes office, what will happen? So you have shared your insights on that and even mentioned several names in talking very concretely about how the Chinese-U.S. relationship will play out. Now we'll move on to Professor Shi In-hong. I'd like to ask you to talk about, well, from the American perspective, it will be on the other side of the Pacific. The votes are still being counted in the United States, but how have you been watching the elections play out in the US? This is a comment that I would like to add personally. There is the American style of election and the Chinese style of election, and I think there is a discourse about how these two election systems compare. And is the Chinese political system better? Well, some politicians say that. So could you share with us your insights and comments on that? And how do you anticipate the United States policies vis-a-vis China? What kind of policies will it have? Uh, and how will the Chinese government respond to the changed policies of the new American administration? And so, what will these changes have? What kind of impact will such changes have on the Korean Peninsula and on the China-U.S. relations and China-Korea relations?
Thank you, Professor, and it's my great honor and pleasure to be here and through online and participate in this significant and 16th and Hankyoreh-Busan International Symposium. And it's my great pleasure to meet all of the distinguished experts and scholars. And I would like to pay my gratitude to the organizer, and especially to Ambassador King and to Professor Chu and other organizers. And also I will say nice words, very nice words toward to my friends for many years, John Pomfret, and I think that he's and the plantation and just delivered is quite enlightened. I'm afraid that I'm unable to answer all the questions and moderator and just presented. So I will focus on from China's perspective and what kind of American posture toward China and after general election. And I would like to speak Chinese, and because many scholars, including John Pamphlet, have a perfect understanding of Chinese, and also speak out in Chinese generally could make me and deliver all what I want to say and within 10 minutes. Anyway, thank you. 所以我今天要讲的是美国大选后的对华态势的预计，大概有一个简要的summary， 然后我也谈一些具体的问题。展望未来，从中国的视野看，就中美关系缓解或者稳定而言，拜登当选美国总统有6项弊益和7项弊端，而且就此来看，拜登当选与假设特朗普连任有重大区别。由于特朗普行政当局在全球治理、中美贸易、中美战略竞斗和外交往来等问题领域倒行逆施，或采取和加剧威胁行动，所以拜登新政府的纠错便迟早。
Professor Xi, excuse me, I'm terribly sorry. Unfortunately, we don't have Chinese Korean or Chinese English translation available at the moment. I'm terribly sorry for that. I should have notified you in advance, but I failed to do that. I'm very sorry. But we have a big audience with their eyes
Okay,
and
I
ears
can
open,
speak
and would you please
yes.
in English?
No problem. Yeah, I will talk about the trends of China-US relations after election.
Thank you.
And first, I will analyze from my perspective pros and cons of Joe Biden as US president from a Chinese perspective. Then I will compare the difference, probable difference between what is in hypothesis, that is Trump presidency, and what is in reality, that is Biden president, in terms of US behavior toward China. First, pros and cons of John Biden as US president from a Chinese perspective, or from a perspective of a minimum and mitigated and a minimum stable Sino-American relations. First, pros. A probable different fundamental objective about China, different from that of Trump administration since June of this year. That is, to force China, like as it were, return to Deng Xiaoping, or return to a less centralized power system of Communist Party in China, rather than subverting and elimination Communist power in China as planned. Trump and his associates declared in June of this year. Second, Biden-Harris administration would be far from wild, far from vulgar, far from volatile, as Trump has been. So I expect it to bring more predictability to US policy toward China, and therefore, in this extent, and to the corresponding stability. Third, and the world more the possibility of military conflict with China. Next, and Biden will pay more attention to US-China diplomatic communication and dialogue at a higher level or an earlier time. That is, to revert diplomatic decoupling between two countries, and especially since the Pompeo-Yang Jie and the dialogue in Hawaii several months ago. And President Biden and opposes high tariff warfare against China. Regarding high tariff, too damaging to American companies and consumers. And of course, lastly, and President Biden and will commit in principle, just in principle, to global governance and multilateralism as China does, though in practice, probably also like China, that is much less so than Europeans. But there will be cons. There will be no significant difference for Biden-Harris administration from that of Trump over the major issues of Taiwan, of Hong Kong, of South China Sea, of Xinjiang, of Tibet, of China's religious situation, of China's human rights situation, or even compare with Trump administration, especially since April of this year, and the Biden administration, and might be more hawkish over issues of Tibet, China's religious situation, and China's human rights situation. Next, I believe the high-tech decoupling from China and the law enforcement actions against China over China's claimed subversive penetrating intelligence activity in the United States would continue in a similar intensity. Next, and of course, hereafter we'll talk about the certainty of, in some degree, in a substantial degree, by President Biden to repair United States ally relationship in both Europe and Asian Pacific. So making a Western united front against China a more solid reality in almost all terms. And there are next 2 points in my observation which are almost missed from most of the predictions of the scholars or experts or medias, and whether in the United States or in China. Biden-Harris and has depended on the indispensable support of the radical wing of the Democratic Party. So having to appeasing radical Democrats' demands about China in various degrees, and especially on the fundamental objective, US-China diplomatic communication and principal commitment to global governance and multilateralism. Over these issues, radical Democrats and have no big difference from Republican populists headed by Trump. And also, President Biden have to appeasing in a major degree of so-called grassroots rights for Trump's electorate. If Democratic administration wants to heal in a remarkable degree a highly divided United States left by Trump, and otherwise, I think that Biden administration will have almost no political self-confidence and moral self-confidence. And also, and there is a legal obligation and for US president, and in our case is new President Biden, to continue to implement the various legal sanctions against China, which already has been made by Trump and both parties in US Congress. Second, I would like to talk about the probable difference between the hypothesis of Trump presidency and the reality that is Biden president in terms of US behavior toward China. On the Trump president as a hypothesis, very clear, there will be increasing danger of military confrontation or even limited conflict in the western part of Western Pacific. There will be stronger squeeze against China for enormous increase of US export to China and maintaining or even increase of high tariffs imposed on China's export to the United States. And there will be more legal sanctions imposed on China over the issue of Hong Kong, of Xinjiang, of South China Sea. There will be escalation of law enforcement actions against claimed subversion, penetration, intelligence activity by China in the United States. There will be acceleration of high-tech decoupling from China. And there will be almost non-existence of US-China cooperation in principle on global governance and global multilateralism. There will be severe arms race between China and the United States, almost all across the region. Possible, even probable, boycott of Beijing Winter Olympic to be held in 2022. Though the Biden administration could or might take the same boycott action. On the Biden presidency, and hope for steps would, I believe, would mainly happen in trade front. I believe there will be sooner or later renegotiation of US-China trade agreement in the direction of reducing the too huge amount of US export forced on China and making it somewhat compatible with China's real demand and real capacity of implementation, and reducing substantially the amount and the rate of China's export to United States, which has been imposed with high tariffs by Trump administration. And also, I believe there would be sooner or later launching of so-called phase 2 trade agreement, and which name may be necessarily were not used by Trump, but anyway, the further trade negotiation sooner or later on so-called structural changes on the Chinese side, the intention of which was virtually abandoned by Trump administration after April 2020. There will be higher level and yield diplomatic dialogue, even negotiation with China, for partial mitigation of bilateral high tension. And also, I believe, there will be much less possibility of US-China military conflict due on the US side to less militant posture toward China and more communication for crisis prevention and crisis management. An arms race with China could be mitigated if China could slow the pace of strategic military buildup. Finally, there will be step-by-step restoration of US-China cooperation in principle or in rhetoric on climate change, civil cybersecurity, anti-terrorism, and the combat against COVID-19 pandemic. Though in concrete practice, the concrete results would be quite limited. And thank you for your attention. Thank you.
네, 시 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Xi. Next, I would like to invite Chief Research Fellow Sung-bae Kim. Which areas that U.S. and China will cooperate or compete with each other? Actually, that is what Professor Su has mentioned. Next, we would like to invite Chief Research Fellow at INSS, Sung-bae Kim. Under the Biden administration, the U.S.-China relations could head towards cooperation. Don Pomfret and Professor Xi, from what I understood, both of you have portrayed a very rosy picture of China-U.S. relations under the Biden administration. So I would like to ask Chief Research Fellow Kim to talk about the new and upcoming U.S.-China relations and its implications for the Korean Peninsula and for inter-Korean relations. Please. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I am Sung-bae Kim with the Institute for National Security Strategy. I would like to thank Mr. Pomfret and Professor Xi for your presentations. Mr. Pomfret, I think you said that we have to wait and see which direction Biden would exactly take. And I believe Professor Xi talked about how U.S.-China relations will improve compared to the previous U.S. administration. I would like to talk about the Korean Peninsula and inter-Korean relations, but before I do that, I would like to also share my views on the U.S.-China relations. The title or theme for session 1 is New Cold War between U.S. and China and Asia's Diplomacy and Security Tasks. Under the Biden administration, will the U.S.-China competition turn into a new Cold War? I personally don't think so. Biden himself has said that we are not going into war with China and that we will not fall into the trap of a new Cold War structure. That was his own words. Meanwhile, under the Trump administration, we did see signs of a new Cold War because there was the trade frictions, there was conflict on standards and also on security fronts, and China's Communist Party and the U.S. administration were engaging in a cutthroat ideological war, very similar to the past Cold War. The U.S. Democratic Party is maintaining a relatively hostile attitude towards China, but Biden is a liberalist. President-elect Biden, when he was serving as Senate, he supported the most preferred nation status of China and China's accession to the WTO. That had been his conviction. Meanwhile, under the Trump administration, there are many anti-China figures. There's John Bolton, for instance, and rightist strategy Steve Bannon. Like Hayden, representative of the USTR, Peter Navarro is also one of them, so on and so forth. So because there are many anti-China figures under the Trump administration, and because Trump himself is a businessman, I think there was a certain coalition in place. But when Biden takes office, I personally think that such anti-China sentiments will no longer be there at the level found under the Trump administration. Many experts say that because the US China competition is structural and systemic, it could go on, and that the Biden administration could turn even more hardline towards China. But I think that is a very simplistic interpretation of the situation. As Professor Shi well pointed out, I think that strategic competition between US and China will fade away. Biden himself has said that unilateral tariff imposition will not take place. And even with the 5G issue, he has said that he will discuss and determine this matter with allied countries. There will be a coordination process. So I don't think there would be any unilateral pressuring towards China by the US, whether it be THAAD or the IMF or whichever issue. I don't think that the Biden administration would take a unilateral view. Of course, when it comes to human rights issues, such as the Hong Kong incident, perhaps the US will maintain a hardline stance, but that would not become so full-fledged to become an ideological war between the two countries. So under the Biden government, I think that there will be more room for options and for maneuver between US and China. Next, with regard to the Korean Peninsula and inter-Korean relations, Biden's diplomatic keyword is diplomacy, alliance, democracy. That's how important he thinks alliance relationships are, which is why defense cost sharing and OPCON transfer are matters that where Biden will respect Korea's opinions. And then moving on to North Korea. I don't think North Korea will be Biden's top priority, to be quite realistic. I say so because based on what he has said so far, Biden's policy priority is the climate change agreement. He has pledged to deal with this. The second is recovering the Iranian nuclear agreement. And he will move very swiftly towards this goal. Thirdly, he wants to restore democracy inside and outside of the US. And he also talked about holding a democracy summit. There was a nuclear summit meeting under President Obama. And similarly, and likewise, Biden is willing to open a democracy summit meeting, which I think will take place during the initial period of his administration. Next, strategic nuclear weapons agreement with Russia. is the fourth matter, and one that requires agreement between US and Russia. Of course, because North Korea is also dealing with nuclear problems, they may mention North Korea, but North Korea again will not be the US's top priority. It will review its alliance relationships, and it will have time for coordination with China, as I see it. In addition, Biden has clearly stated that he will restore diplomacy and he will empower experts and negotiators, and that he will restore the diplomatic issues that has been destroyed under the Trump administration. What this means is that in the near future, there is a low possibility of a US DPRK summit meeting taking place. There may be working level meetings, but not a sudden and third round of summit between US and the DPRK. So we will be entering into season 2 of strategic patience. North Korea, nobody knows how North Korea may react or decide to provoke. So the Korean government's role becomes very important. Ever since the summit meeting of 2018 between US and the DPRK, North Korea has not engaged in ICBM or missile tests, nuclear tests. And combined military exercises are no longer taking place between ROK and the US. It is a phase of a sort of a moratorium. This state should be maintained, but if combined military exercises between ROK and the US resumes next spring, then it's not difficult to predict how North Korea would react to this, meaning it will react very negatively. On the humanitarian front and cooperation on the humanitarian front, Biden is very open to the idea of providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea, which is why next year, Biden's decision may be. I think that it would be a good idea for Biden to focus on diplomacy and supporting cooperation between the two Koreas. I would like to conclude with this. Thank you very much.
다음은
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim. Now we'll move on to Professor Cha. Could you please talk about, from the perspective of South Korea, in the midst of the new Cold War between the US and China, what are your prospects regarding the relations, Korea's relations with US and with China? And what options are available to South Korean government? Thank you very much. I've been listening very attentively since this morning, and I think everyone here, the participants, have benefited from the insights that have been shared. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Hegel. In the early 19th century, even in Europe, there was a lot of interest focused on Asia because it was a different civilization. Napoleon went all the way to Egypt. So during Hegel's times, he was very interested in China. And because of and that the Westerners will enter China and civilize or turn the Chinese into a civilization. And I think we are at another different turning point right now. In terms of the defense budget or the GDP, China is still about 70%. But when it comes to per capita income, China has already caught up. So we are facing a phase of very structural competition between the US and China. Although we are a bit more optimistic under the Biden administration, the structural competition and confrontation, it will be very difficult to change that. The Spartans and Athenians, during the war between the Spartans and the Athenians, there will be a war will change the structure of both civilizations, and it will escalate into a psychological warfare that feeds on the fear of the political leaders of the two countries at war. And if there are many case studies like that in the history of human civilization. But I was able to find a few cases where the political leaders deliberately and consciously avoided war. But in majority of cases, war, whether it's hot or cold, will be the way that most countries in conflict or in confrontation will go. And I think the public opinion is not very good right now regarding China in the United States. And of course, President Trump took advantage of that, of the anti-Chinese sentiments among Americans. And he had a personal interest in and political interest in that. And if you look at the political circle in Washington, I think it's the norm that they don't think very highly of China, and they have antagonism towards China. They want to go for decoupling. And so the methodology and approach may be a little more gentlemanly or sophisticated, but the basic, fundamental attitude of trying to check China will probably not change. In that regard, what would be the Biden administration's policies towards China? Foreign affairs is a journal, an influential journal in the United States, and in March, April, as a presidential candidate, Biden contributed an article about why the United States should take the lead again. Of course, he consulted with his advisors to announce or declare his foreign affairs policies and direction if he becomes president. And so whether it's in the multilateral system or in the free market, Biden wants to reclaim or recover the American position and status in the international community, going back to the WTO system and going back to the Paris Agreement and restoring many things that the Trump administration had destroyed. But when it comes to popular policies, because of structural reasons, Of course, the Biden administration will be very different from Trump, but it will also be different from Obama. But one thing that we can find hope in, as was also mentioned by Mr. Pomfret, when Biden was senator and he was when he was vice president, he met with Xi Jinping about 8 times, and there is quite a close personal connection between the two political leaders. So perhaps that personal friendship can be a positive influence in the Biden administration's policies towards China. But the policymakers and the opinion leaders in the United States, the consensus among such people is that the need is still there to check China, although this will play out in a much more sophisticated way than before. As for the ROK China relationship, South Korea China relationship, Xi Jinping has not been able to visit South Korea. Well, at least not this year. Maybe perhaps next year, when the Communist Party will be holding its convention. Because of time constraints, I will have to summarize. But from the perspective of the South Korea China relationship, the 6 to 7 months until the Biden takes office will be a strategically important period or window for South Korea, where we can make connections with and also maintain confidence with the president-elect. So there would be actions or measures that we can take. However, and I think the military exercises between the ROK and US that is scheduled for March next year, that has to be stopped. Because there is a transition of power at that time. Perhaps there could be a temporary peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So if the leaders could make a declaration that they will halt, at least temporarily, any joint military exercises between ROK and US, that would have a very positive influence on maintaining peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Because we have some more time for discussions, I would like to change the order. I don't think, actually, we don't have enough time, so we would like to skip the 3-minute concluding remarks. And I would like to open the floor right away for discussions with the 4 panelists. You can make comments or raise questions to the 4 speakers. Please raise your hand if you wish to raise a question or make a comment. I would like to begin by asking Mr. Pomfret a question. Under the Biden administration, the mid-range missile deployment system, do you think that the mid-range missile deployment program will continue on?
Yeah, that would be my evaluation. I think that perhaps Biden will hold off a bit on moving forward, but I think that's an inevitable program that's going to happen. I tend to agree with Professor Schur on these issues that Biden will package his policies perhaps in a more digestible fashion, but I don't really see a fundamental change in the direction of where America is headed vis-a-vis its relationships with its what it believes to be its competitors. Both in the case of Europe, it would be Russia, and in the case of Asia, it would be China. I am not optimistic like Professor Kim is that we're going to see a significant shift in Biden administration priorities versus those of Donald Trump's. I think that Biden will do so, according to from what Professor Cha said, in a more marketable, sort of friendly manner, but I don't really see any fundamental change, specifically in military posture vis-a-vis the Chinese and vis-a-vis the Russians.
자, 감사합니다. 그러면 손을 드신 분에게 발언권을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 다음 말씀.
I'd like to give a chance to those who have raised. Yes, doctor, please. I would like to raise a question first, because this is an issue that is very controversial these days. First of all, I would like to ask Mr. Pomfret this question. Biden's oath to office seems very plausible, and Korea and the US need to cooperate on various fronts. But many Koreans remain quite concerned. Some say that our foreign minister is visiting the United States, and some people think that is too premature, and some people think that is not enough. So, going into the future, whether it be the North Korean nuclear problem or any other security issue, there needs to be close coordination between Korea and the US. So, can you provide any tips or advice for Korea, please? Which people do you think we should contact and cooperate with? Please provide your tips and advice on this. That was my question to Mr. Pomfret. To Professor Shi, I would like to also raise a question. Under the Trump administration, denuclearization negotiations with North Korea took a top-down approach, which is why the presence of China wasn't that huge. Of course, Chairman Kim Jong-un did consult with China during the summit meeting, but overall, China's presence was not that huge. So under the Biden administration, Biden is to place importance on working level talks. And Biden is likely to emphasize the role of China. They have huge fatigue when it comes to the North Korean issue. So Korea and China's role, I think, is something that is perceived to be very important by the Biden administration. So what do you think China can actually do with regard to the North Korean nuclear problem? Do you think we could see a reprise of the six-party talks?
수인홍 교수님 답을 해주시는데요. 시간이 좀
By Professor Shi. Please respond within 3 minutes, please.
Oh, it's my response. Okay. Thank you for that question. In terms of tips with dealing with the Biden administration, I think the first thing is to understand that there are some fundamental shifts that have happened in the United States over the course of the last 15 years, specifically in terms of Americans' attitudes towards China, that are fundamental and that will last through the Trump administration and into the Biden administration. And in fact, a tougher policy on China is the only thing. It's in fact, one could argue that it's the only bipartisan issue on which Republicans and Democrats agree. And so thinking that Biden is going to have a significant amount of flexibility to craft his own China policy, I think you need to kind of begin to reconsider that. The Senate will and people like senators like Mark Rubio will exert a significant influence on this relationship going forward. Mark Rubio on the Democratic side, and other senators like Senator Warner on the Republican side, and other senators like Senator John Warner on the Democratic side. So there's really a bipartisan consensus on embracing a tougher position on China, not simply in the Trump administration, but I think the Biden administration will inherit that. And how does that impact US relations with the Republic of Korea? I think there will be pressure on your government from a Biden administration to resume the military exercises, regardless of whether it's Trump, regardless of whether it's Biden. I think that pressure is going to happen because a strong US alliance with South Korea entails a strong military alliance with South Korea. And the Americans are extremely worried on both sides of the aisle in the United States that South Korea is going increasingly soft on North Korea. And that's a huge concern in America. And I think there will be pressure on your country from the Biden administration to resume those military exercises because the United States military feels like they're necessary. And so I think does the South Korean military as well. So thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 수윤원 교수님 말씀해 주시죠.
I think that there has already been a history of collective dealing with North Korea by both Trump and Xi Jinping, and which will condition and China's approach to North Korea problem during Biden administration. And throughout 2017, China, under great pressure from Trump and a great coercion from Trump, and China and participate in the making of almost 6 times the 7 times to UN Security Council sanction against North Korea, almost to make North Korea and have a risk of making North Korea as a China's permanent enemy. And but what China get nothing. And since beginning of 2018, and Trump launched almost comprehensive, hawkish policy against China. So in this kind of situation, and China, and Kim Jong-un and both revise greatly the Sino-North Korea relations, and beginning in the March of 2018, and then through several, visits of Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and each other. And of course, Kim Jong-un come to Beijing much more than Xi Jinping come to Pyongyang. And there's a consensus that China will not let the denuclearization to damage greatly and bilateral relation with Pyongyang. There's also a consensus that the ball is in American court, and the United States should agree with at least greater relaxation of UN sanction against North Korea, and even better, and unilateral sanction from the United States and from its allies and against North Korea. And also, and China will, and China, I think that probably all possibility committed to and to economically support North Korea, let it at least in a very low level of the sustainability to maintain its economy. This means maintain the minimum stability of the regime. All these are fundamental and consolidated principles. I don't think that Xi Jinping will change these principles. And especially if you think that the strategic rivalry under Biden administration against China generally will continue. So I don't think that China will take a very hawkish attitude toward North Korea again, and especially if North Korea only, make long-range missile tests, not make, nuclear tests. All North Korea, just like now, have not made any, nuclear or long-range missile tests, but insist on North Korea's rights and to possess minimum nuclear and deterrence against the United States and its allies. I don't think that there is a rosy picture, and in both, Sino-American relation in the future, or in the situation of the peninsula. Especially, I don't think that and China will move again much nearer toward the United States, toward even South Korea and on the North Korean nuclear program. I don't think that this kind of past already, this kind of situation already has been passed, maybe forever, especially because overall strategic situation and China face, especially with the United States. Although I think that this is maybe not good was said and with in the symposium with our and ROK colleagues, but I don't think that we should to make some romantic words to make our friends become more optimistic than and otherwise in fact.
감사합니다. 지금 시간이요.
Yes, thank you. It's 3 p.m. Korean time. And I have to give myself about 1 minute to make some closing remarks to wrap up the session. So we have about 34 minutes left. So please prioritize your questions and comments. Please keep your questions to 1 minute and your responses or answers to 3 minutes. Professor Cha, you have a question? So we have 2 Korean panelists and 2 foreign speakers. So the questions and comments are going which way and that. But listening to the moderator, Ambassador Kim's comments, I'd like to add my comments to his and also ask a few questions. When it comes to North Korean policies of the United States and also Korean Peninsula, regarding the Korean Peninsula, Biden once said that he will empower his advisors and other North Korean experts and Korean Peninsula experts. And he also added, including China. And so, although the comment was very general, I think Biden does have in mind a role that China should be playing. So a question to Mr. Pomfret. The Korean Peninsula is not a very high priority when it comes to the foreign policies of the United States. Well, traditionally. Although Americans do have the policy of strategic patience, and there is talk of strategic patience version season 2. If there are missile programs and missile weapons development, then will this drive up the priority of the Korean Peninsula on the foreign affairs agenda of Washington, like all the way to the status of the Pakistan issue? That's my question for Mr. Pomfret. And to Professor Shi, the One Road, One Belt policy has been continuing for some time, and South Korea is being pressured to join the Quad Plus together with New Zealand and Vietnam. So if South Korea becomes an active member of the Quad in intervening in security issues related to China, then what would be the anticipated response from China, although it might not be as extreme as the THAAD situation a few years back? So, Mr. Pomfret, would you like to respond first?
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Professor Cha. I think that when it comes to North Korea can propel itself into a very serious place in American foreign policy concerns by doing something like another nuclear test or repeated ICBM tests. That will get the attention of the Biden administration. I guarantee it will. But I want to refer you to the remarks that my friend Professor Yinhong just made about China's perspective on this, that China feels burned, in effect, by the United States on this issue. And so it's not going to be playing that game with America anymore. I think Professor Shi's analysis was spot on. And so if North Korea pushes the button, if you will, on missile tests and even more importantly on nuclear tests, it's going to become a very important issue very quickly to the Biden administration. And then the Biden administration will put significant pressure on South Korea to walk in very close step with the United States, considering the fact that we no longer can rely on China as being an important, a significant partner with us, because the Chinese have felt burned by the previous administration's attitudes on North Korea. So that's, in short, what I think. It's not a rosy picture at all. I think it's a very dangerous one. And I totally agree with Professor Shi that we are entering, we're going to stay in troubled waters when it comes to US-China, clearly with North Korea being part of that equation as well. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 시 교수님 말씀해 주십시오.
And you talk about the China's policy toward the Belt and Road and its implication for and the China's relation with your country. I think that if you look at Belt and Road and whether for the new complexity and imposed by global COVID-19 pandemic, or because of the unsustainability of many projects and or a less profitability of many projects along the Belt and Road, or and because of the nationalistic, domestic politics in those so-called corporate countries and so and so. And the fact is that even since middle of 2018 or so, Belt and Road has been greatly or maybe quietly on the Chinese side, but still greatly retrenched. And since the pandemic broke out and retrenched even furthermore, I personally don't know and China make any great pressure or serious pressure upon ROK to take part in any, part of this Belt and Road or any other Chinese multilateral, economic cooperation projects in the world. Of course, and China expected that the Seoul will not make any public criticism by ROK government against anything China said or is doing. But I don't think that China really serious pressure and ROK government to take part in China's overseas economic projects. And also, I want to emphasize again and again. And you look at the still deeply, divided situation within the United States. And roughly speaking, the situation have not changed greatly. And when 2018 Trump, and with the support of the white grassroots, and even within the Democrat Party, the political division and cultural division and social division is still quite severe. And you look at the campaign, and the Biden have a strategy that only mainly focus on his criticism attack against Trump for damaging American democracy. But he never to launch in a minimum, clear and systematic degree his policy program, domestic or international. And so I think that this kind of situation, and due to American deeply divided domestic situation and of lacking of policy, program, clear and systematic, whether domestic or international, of Biden administration will continue for quite a long time. And do not expect Trump, I'm sorry, do not expect President Biden will sooner launch a very clear policy and about China and about the nuclear program of North Korea, or about Iran, or about something just like that. He has no clear policy program because, and his domestic political task of healing American society, American people, are almost something near to, and at least in the short term, impossible task. So do not expect that the Biden would be quite competent and strong and clear in his foreign policy, at least for a little longer while. And of course, what Trump already in the making us American national foreign policy, except for some very radical, and which is and without any widespread support from American political world and society, except for that. And Biden, I think, will continue the substance of foreign policy of Trump administration for a while, except, and he will principally to commit to return to the WHO, Paris Climate Change Accord, and so on. But foreign policy is not his priority.
감사합니다. 다음 질문 넘어가기 전에요. 우선
Moving on to the next question with regard to what Professor C just pointed out. I think he was trying to say that the Biden administration, in its efforts to establish external policies, it will focus on relieving. It will be doing certain things with regard to that. So, Mr. Pomfret, do you have any comments with regard to what Professor Shi just mentioned?
Yes, definitely. I actually agree with him completely. I think the nation that Biden is going to inherit is a fractured nation, and the thing he will be focusing on is trying to heal the rifts in American society, which is a Herculean task. It's an enormously difficult task. Secondly, I think that in terms of U.S. relations with China, that is not going to be a priority, even though there's lots of questions he's going to be forced to answer relatively quickly. But it's not his foreign policy priority. His foreign policy priority is to mend the transatlantic relationship and to strengthen America's relations with its allies in Asia. And he will focus on that first. And China and Russia will be much later dealt with, because he will only deal with those nations once he's confident enough in the alliances that he's rebuilt. So China is not a priority, nor will North Korea, as long as North Korea doesn't go crazy with weapons testing. The focus will be first domestically, because the domestic problems are intense. We have a COVID crisis, clearly, that is exploding once again. We will have an economic crisis on top of that, and we have a crisis, a fractious political system. So those three tasks, just dealing with that, will probably take up his whole administration. And then on top of that, he needs to actually improve his relations with the allies before he can actually approach America's competitors, if you will, Beijing and Moscow.
감사합니다. 사회자 특권을 이용해서 또 한 가지 제가
Yes, I would like to ask one further question to Mr. Pomfret. Recently, President Moon Jae-in of Korea talked about how the U.S. Democratic Party and the Korean ruling party have a history of cooperation, and the peace process that Korea is pursuing with is something that President Moon is very hopeful about. So, what are your thoughts on this? President-elect Biden and his team members, do you think they will be cooperative towards South Korea?
My sense, just from talking with people in Washington, is that there's not a large amount of hope in a South Korean peace process with North Korea. The fear is that South Korea is going to be bamboozled, be tricked, if you will, by North Korea into making concessions that will help to benefit the regime of Kim Jong-un without really pushing the two countries closer together. I think there's a lot of cynicism in the Democratic Party about North Korea's peace olive branches. And I think that cynicism is only increased over time. So if the short answer to the question would be that America will be supportive if it believes that there's actually going to be some benefit out of these processes, but there's a very jaundiced view, even inside the Democratic Party, of North Korean peace proposals and some type of rapprochement between the South and the North. And so while I respect President Moon's optimism that this type of program should be given a chance, I think in the United States and even in the Democratic Party, they don't look at this as something that's gonna be able to walk the walk, if you will.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 이제
Thank you very much. From Busan to Beijing to LA, we have connected 3 panelists. Why don't we give Professor Shi and Mr. Pomfret to raise questions to the Korean side if you have any. If you have any questions, sir, please raise them to our side. Of course.
General, I have a question and would like to
yeah.
be raised and to any professor in the table. And from my listening to your presentation, and I think that why you ROK scholars are so optimistic to the remarkable improvement, or at least remarkable mitigation of Sino-American relations. And if Biden, of course, in fact, Biden become president, and are still not so clear. And also, if I connected with and what John have said of the dissatisfaction from within the United States toward Moon Jae-in's attitude toward North Korea, I will look at another corner. You know, Japan, Australia, British, and even in less degree, France and Germany, they have more angry, more worry about China's strategic expansionism. And they are, with American persuasion or without American persuasion. And they become much more, dynamic to build up some strategic cooperation among themselves, as well with the United States, to dealing with China. In this kind of situation, for example, if you look at the Prime Minister Suga's Japan, the actions are very strategic against China up to now in a social time. Australia, of course, and Boris Johnson, and so and so. So, and do South Korean scholars feel that the Moon Jae-in's friendly approach toward China and could become somewhat more difficult to insist on, more difficult to sustain under this kind of the negative and approach toward, you can say, and most of the advanced industrial countries toward China.
네, 그 시인홍 교수님께서 우리 두 분 한국 디스커선트께 여쭙습니다.
Professor Shi has raised questions to our Korean discussants. What are the grounds for your optimism? Was his question. I would like to ask Dr. Sung-bae Kim to respond to Professor Shi's questions within 3 minutes. Yes, before I try to answer your question, while listening to Mr. Pomfret speak, I became quite concerned. So is it really so that the tone in DC is not that different from what it was under the Trump administration. If that is the case, then I think that is quite a challenge. In November of 2017, North Korea has test fired the Hwasong ICBM. Ever since, it has not test fired anything. And the sixth nuclear test was quite way back. The Hwasong 15 is a missile that has a range that could reach mainland United States. I think the reason North Korea halted such missile tests is because it thinks it has already proved its capabilities. And ever since, ROC-US joint exercises have halted as well. But into the Biden administration, if all of the tensions go away and if combined exercises resume, and if things go back to the way they used to be, then I think North Korea may be triggered to want to prove itself all over again. That would only back up Trump's comments. So that would have a reverse effect. And do we want to prove President Trump to be right on that? Is my question. I think this is a very serious matter.
한미 간에
So this is something that we should be thinking earnestly of, especially among the think tanks in both South Korea and the United States. So in that regard, because I am so hopeful and because of my concerns, that's why maybe we might sound quite optimistic. Because if there is no hope, then what's the point of worrying? And when I talk to the Democrats and also the Republicans, it's easier to talk to the well, comparatively to the Democrats, especially Michelle Flournoy, the Secretary of State elect or to be. I've met her before, and I found it quite easy to talk to her. And I think that would be the same feeling that most of the foreign affairs people in Korea have when it comes to the to Michelle Flournoy. So, regarding this comment or question, Mr. Pomfret, do you have any comments or response to that? But before I give the floor to Mr. Pomfret, maybe I can talk a little bit about Japan because that was not so much mentioned. There was a media report that upon the request of the United States, the then President Park Geun-hye was asked by Vice President Biden to talk to the United States regarding the issue of comfort women. And in the end, what came out was the Korea-Japan agreement in 2015. And actually, Biden expressed disappointment regarding that agreement between Japan and South Korea. What do you think of that? And the policies of the Biden administration vis-a-vis Japan. So could you add those comments regarding that issue to your response, Mr. Pomfret?
Thank you. So on the comfort women issue, but more broadly, the Biden administration clearly will re-engage in issues between allies. And so the South Korea and Japan often have a very fractious relationship. The Trump administration really took a hands-off policy, generally but backing Japan in most cases when it came to any type of verbal kerfuffles with the South Koreans. I think you could probably expect the Biden administration to be slightly more even-handed in how it looks at the two sides. In terms of Professor Kim's questions about optimism, I think it's important to be, I mean, it might be easier to engage with Democratic Party strategists, including Michelle Flournoy, on these type of issues. But the reality is that you have to understand that Americans' views on Asia have been deeply colored by an increasingly negative spiral in their perception of China. And so that is going to color how we engage with everybody, including our allies and our friends. And that obsession is going to be a growing one, regardless of whether the Republicans or the Democrats are in power. And so I don't think it's an issue of having no hope. I think that both China and the United States, during this period where China is rising and will continue to rise, and America is wobbly, clearly, that it's incumbent on both nations to manage the increasing competition in such a way that we don't end up blowing each other up, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. But we have to be aware that this relationship is not going to get better. And smaller countries like South Korea need to figure out ways to manage the Americans, manage the Chinese, so that you can continue to be the prosperous, economically forward-looking democracy that you are. And so having a clear understanding that the US-China relationship is not going to turn into a kind of a wonderful love fest anytime soon, I think is important, so that South Korea can figure out what is important for South Korea, what it wants America to do for it, and what it wants China to do for it, and try to reach a kind of accommodation with both nations. And so it's okay not to be optimistic about the relationship and to understand in a clear-eyed way that it's not going to be very good, but that will help actually South Korea to move forward, so you can understand what's really important for you and for your nation.
예, 감사합니다. 지금 남은 시간으로 봐서 한 2개 정도 질문 답변을 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 다음.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions or comments before we wrap up this session. Do the Korean panelists have any comments or questions? Professor Cha? Yes, the floor is yours. I have a question for Mr. Pomfret. Within the Biden administration, just now I asked a question about the priority, how high the North Korea will be in the foreign affairs policy priority in the few months ahead of us before Biden takes office. I think in that period, in the past Democratic government or administration, I think the Biden administration, as it prepares to take office, needs to reflect on why the strategic patience policy of Obama or the past Democratic administrations failed. Why, despite the strategic patience, North Korea felt the need to continue with its missile or nuclear tests, even during that period of strategic patience? How earnestly is the American administration or government is Washington thinking of the North Korean issue or the North Korean nuclear issue? I'd like to ask that question to Mr. Pomfret and ask for his comments on the stance of the administration, Democrat administration right now.
Thanks for the question, Professor Shah. I think that North Korea is not a priority at all in terms of foreign policy unless and until it resumes missile testing and, God forbid, nuclear testing. It will remain on the back burner very much as Biden is forced to deal with so many domestic issues. I mean, right now, it's hard for you in South Korea to imagine it, but right now we had 100 some odd thousand new cases of COVID every day. We have eruptions of COVID all over the country now. We are a nation that is not even fighting this pandemic. The pandemic is beating us. And so in that and on top of that, we're fractured politically and our economy's in free fall. And so given those three very important domestic challenges that Biden is facing, you can't even imagine that he could deal with a crisis such as South Korea if it erupted. If it erupted, they'd have to deal with it, but it's not what they want to deal with. And so while I take your point that strategic patience was a failure, and strategic patience 2 will probably be a failure as well, I can't imagine that that's a priority in any way, shape, or form of the Biden administration as they're confronting what is really a very chaotic domestic situation in our country as well. And Biden has embraced the idea that the only way that the United States can engage profitably and positively with the rest of the world is if we get our house in order. And that's what his focus is going to be on, and which is sort of ironic because he's a president who cut his teeth in foreign affairs issues, but now is being forced to be a domestic-oriented president, sort of the opposite of Obama, who was very much of a domestic-oriented politician who was forced to deal with crises around the world. So Biden is going to be different in that sense. It's really going to be a continuation in a strange way of America First, because we really are a sick and a nation in need of healing. Whether he can actually succeed or not, to Professor Shi's point, I think is an open question as well. But North Korea is not a priority, and the only, in terms of foreign affairs, the only thing that the priority would be is to be strengthening our relations with our allies so that they actually can help us deal with our problems at home.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we are running out of time. Thank you for your comments. I feel my obligation to apologize to Professor Shi not for preparing Chinese translation again. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Shi. We have about 3 minutes left. Professor Shi, would you like to take the floor to make any comment or any message to
Thank you very much for your kindness. And of course, I fully understand there is there is a very wonderful and deep memory. And in Seoul, in Tokyo, in Paris, in Berlin, about the wonderful approach and attitude of Obama administration toward allies. And Biden is vice president at that time. So perhaps some people and have wonderful memories of Obama administration think that, Vice President Biden become President Biden. So things will return to normal. I don't think so. And the world has changed dramatically, profoundly. And the United States have changed greatly, domestically, internationally. And as well as China, almost as well as most of the important countries in the world. So maybe Biden personally and have no other, reference to refer to. So maybe in some very important issue area, he want to back to the past. But objective environment, which has very profoundly and dramatically changed, and even without the COVID-19 pandemic. So in many issue areas, including American relations with allies, including your country, are okay. And what Biden can do is only back to the past by halfway. So President Biden is definitely not Vice President Biden. Biden administration is definitely not Obama administration. So I think that even if you consider, and Xi Jinping administration now is not Xi Jinping administration, and 2 or 3 years after 18 Party Congress, or. So I think that we have to adapt to change. We have to take a more, careful and serious and consideration about this world, which definitely has become much worse than several years ago. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 여기서 조금 더
Thank you very much. The camera will be turned off shortly, so I would like to conclude this session with this. Mr. Pomfret and Professor Shi, Dr. Kim, and Professor Cha, thank you very much for your wonderful comments. We are living in very uncertain times, and the questions and comments raised today helped us to have a more insightful view of the realities that we are facing. I would like to thank all four discussants for your participation today, and I would like to also thank the foundation and its staff and President Lee of the Hankyoreh Peace Research Institute for your preparations. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
네, 시간이
Yes, we have engaged in very heated discussions indeed. I would like to allocate more time, except that we are now no longer have time remaining. I would like to thank the moderator, Soo-gwon Kim, for his wonderful moderation as well. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We will have a 20-minute break. During the uptime roundtable, we will have a separate different organization of the desk. So please stay out of this main hall for a short while.
심포지엄 기획위원님들께서 함께하시는 자유로운 토론회
We will engage in very frank and honest discussions in the upcoming roundtable, which will not be broadcast live through YouTube. Those of you who are no longer taking part in the roundtable, you are free to leave. I will meet you again in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.